Up till now, we have started with Adam, Eve. We went to Noah. I spent some time spelling out what Noah is, who Noah is, where Noah is historically. I then jumped into Joseph and way later in history and said, I believe this is Joseph. I talked about the 7 years of feast, 7 years of famine. And what I did is I skipped Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that might be a little bit hard to follow. I was just trying to prove a point that, hey, let me go way further up and you can see what I can see. But it turns out Joseph had a father, and Joseph's father was Jacob. Now, I would say traditionally, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are sort of they're the cornerstones of traditional Judaism. And all I can say is I see it potentially differently than maybe other people might. One can even argue that the main three religions in the world, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, are called the Abrahamic religions. And they all believe in a man called Abraham and his son Isaac and his sons, Jacob and Esau. We're going to look at this a little differently. So, let's start with just looking at a little bit of Genesis 25. So Genesis 25, before I jump over, is kind of where Jacob begins. So there's a little bit of Abraham, there's a little bit of Isaac, and there's a little bit of Jacob. I'm going to skip the first, it's about about 20 verses or so, give or take. And we're going to skip that, and we're just going to focus on the Jacob part. It's right after they talk about Ishmael. I'm going to skip that part too. We will come back to all that at some point. And what I will do is I will accidentally tell you about Isaac. It's not my goal today to tell you about Isaac. I feel like that one deserves like its whole explanation. In fact, there's so much about Isaac, it would take a very long time. But I'm building a story here. So let's go to Joseph, and then we're going to step one back to his father, Jacob. And I believe, and then when I accidentally tell you about Isaac and Jacob, it will just sort of reinforce Joseph, so that the three of you that follow this aren't confused, and the rest of you can move along. So let's take a look. Genesis 25. And notice I titled it The Birth of Esau and Jacob, because I believe for some reason, for lots of reasons, but for an interest, for whatever reasons, Esau seems to take a back seat, and I feel like it might be literally impossible to understand this story if you don't fully understand who both of these nations are. So, just to begin, here's a child's representation of the famous Jacob Esau stew story, where he's selling his birthright for a bowl of soup, which, if we're just taking this story literally, it's a silly story. It's a pretty silly story. It almost doesn't make any sense, and even if you just try to apply basic logic to it on a literal basis, That Esau is one dumb guy. And that Jacob, he's a wily fella. But I think there's more going on, and I think it deserves a better explanation than a lot of what I've heard. Here is a very old painting depicting this same story, where you have Rebecca and Isaac, and Rebecca is helping Jacob deceive his blinding father as Esau comes in from the field from a hunt, and you can see this little look of disappointment. Here's another Renaissance painting of Isaac. Sure does look like a less than trustworthy individual, with his brother in red, his hairy red brother, and we will get to that in the bowl of red stew. Here's another one. Oh, those are some very hairy arms. It's hard to believe that they are not just brothers, but twins. Twins. I'm assuming that's fraternal. So let's just kind of go, instead of reading the whole thing and then going back, I'm going to try something a little different this time. We're just going to go verse by verse. And hopefully you're going to see that every verse, let me just say this. We're going to do this verse by verse. And hopefully it just explains itself. And by the time I finish, and it's only, I don't know, I think maybe like 15 verses or less. By the time you're done, once you frame this correctly, which is what I'm trying to do in opposition to the rest of humanity, I feel like it's the Joseph story, which I still may be the only man on earth getting this, but eventually, once you get like 5 of these pieces, it's just going to make the most sense. And I don't even have to change history. I just have to get you to not continue. It's all in your mindset. It's all in your mindset. We believe what we believe. We never really thought about it. It just was hit. We were hit with it so young that we're just sort of stuck. Like there's a loop, and it's virtually impossible to get you to push out of that, because unfortunately it kind of requires you to rethink everything you know. So I mean, one could argue I'm asking you to undo all of the strings of your brain for these little experiments, but hey, that can't possibly be that big of a problem. So anyways, back to we're going to start with the very first verse of this story. So it's not the first verse of the chapter. Genesis 25, verse 19. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. So verse 1 seems like the least important verse ever, but if you just listen to it, it's asking you some questions that, if you want it to ask you questions, it's asking you questions. If you don't, it's not. It just seems like, yeah, of course. But it's saying, we're going to talk about what happened after Isaac. And Isaac is what happened after Abraham. So you should ask yourself, who's Abraham? Who's Isaac? So that I know where I am, so that when I'm given Jacob and Esau, I go, yes, of course, that is the next logical chronicle choice. So this is the genealogy of Isaac. So what we're going to talk about are Isaac's kids. Isaac's kids. The children of Isaac. And Isaac is the child of Abraham. So we haven't talked about Abraham. I've kind of just in passing mentioned this to you, and I'm going to in passing mention this to you again. And unfortunately, I'm leaving a gap between Sumer and Akkad and the European colonialism of the New World. So unfortunately, there's a little bit of space between those. And the first one that we would encounter, and you just have to sort of not accept it, but we'll just say, this is what I believe. I'm not going to explain it now. Let me come back and hopefully it'll all tie together. So Abraham is the Mycenaean kingdom from Mycenae, Greece. As you can see, this is a map of Greece. There's Thebes and Mycenae and the islands and all these little red dots are settlements and the different kingdoms within that empire. Okay, that brings us to Isaac. So the question would be, if Abraham, the father of Isaac, begot, right? Abraham begot. Abraham had a son. It was a whole big deal. His wife, Sarah, was old and he was old and they didn't think they were going to have any kids. So then Abraham is enticed to have a child with his wife's handmaiden from Egypt. And then God's like, no, I got this, seriously. So Isaac, who is Isaac? Who is the son of super ancient Greece or Mycenaean Greece? Well, that would be ancient Greece. Ancient Greece would be the son of Mycenaean Greece. Just makes logical sense. And ancient Greece was also having some trouble with kids. And then eventually God was like, no, I've got this one as well. And he and his wife had twins. So ancient Greece must have spawned twins, which means there must be two entities that are going to emerge at a similar time that are not ancient Greece. That's the key to being a son, is you can't be a continuation directly. Otherwise you just get older. That's how that works. So Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as his wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now, what I should say before we go a little further is, it is my contention, in direct opposition to men that know better than I do, because I am a walking moron. Egypt, Assyria, Syria, and Babylon, and there's some more, are not those countries. Egypt is not Egypt, Assyria is not Assyria, and Syria is not Syria. And I will explain a little further. So we're going to break this little cluster of verses down. So right here it begins with Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as a wife. Now remember, if you're a nation and you marry a culture, you are now a new civilization. You are now a one entity, right? You're a married couple. So that doesn't happen till Isaac is 40. Now, interestingly enough, ancient Greece is considered to be founded about 800 BC. Specifically, and I want you to notice this number because it will come into play at some point when I get around to it. Not just 800 BC, 776. They use the first Olympic Games of that year as the founding date for ancient Greece, which is very interesting. If you just put a little 1 in front of that first 7, that would be 1776. Just something to put in the back of your head along with the other things that we have put there. And notice that in this little blurb here that I stole from Wikipedia, it says traditionally ancient Greek period was taken to begin with the date of the first Olympic Games in 776, but most historians now extend the term back to about 1000 BC towards the beginning of the Greek Dark Ages. And it's the Greek Dark Ages I want you to see, not the fact that they're they're re-understanding history, but typically and traditionally, and for the sake of this argument, 800, 776, that is the start date. So if you were going to be 40, right, 40, and I told you Genesis math, just multiply it by 10. So that would be 400. So 400 years before 800 or 776, was there an important event that would cause a shift in historical understanding from one age, let's call Abraham an age, to a new age? Did anything happen like that? Oh, almost to the year. How about that? Is something called well, this is a famous book if you're in tiny academic circles. 1177, the year civilization collapsed. That is referring to the Bronze Age collapse, which led to the Greek Dark Ages. So the old system of the Mycenaeans ended, along with many, many other nations in the Mediterranean around that time, which led to a 400-year dark age, which just happens to be how old Isaac was when he finally got around to being civilized. So that's just something I want you to see as of it. And not only does that 40 years work, it works almost to the year. He's kind of pulling this year not out of thin air, but it's an approximation. So not only was it about 1200 BC, it was about 1177. So Isaac was 40 years old when he became civilized, when he got a wife, when he had culture. And this culture that he took, these people in the area of the what we think of as the nation of Greece, in that area around 800 BC became civilized, which just happens to be the birth of the ancient Greek civilization. And this civilization was related to Bethuel the Syrian of Padan Aram. which is related to Laban the Syrian. I told you the names mean things, and so it's important to spend time understanding those meanings that give you kind of a deeper story. And so Isaac's wife, the culture that created Greece, ancient Greece, Rebecca, her name meant tying firmly, fastening, binding, noosed cord, captivating snare, beauty that ensnares, grace that enraptures. And so, on its face, one could argue that that could represent a lot of things. So, on its own, it's just convenient that these are it's interesting that it uses the words beauty and grace and snare. But beauty and grace would be something that you could directly tie to the classical Greek world. Now, what is ancient Greece, right? So if Rebecca represents the culture, well, what is the culture? What is that? Like, what is it seen as? So we all can kind of go, oh, that's Greek, or that's classical. So what is that classical Greek civilization? It was this emergence of democracy, right? This political philosophy. It's philosophy, this realistic art and sculpture. It's the people that gave us the first attempt at much of our math, including heliocentrism and atoms, and much of the things that we take for granted were pioneered in Greek times. Now, this is not, and this is something that I had to kind of figure out. It is commonly thought of that ancient Greek culture is Hellenism, and that's only half true. So Hellenism is not what I'm talking about, because that is more of this fusion of the ancient Greek philosophical, classical, scientific, artistic world with Eastern concepts, right? As the Greeks Hellenized the world, they began to accumulate some of the other Eastern philosophies and sort of create a grab bag of thoughts. That's Hellenism, and we'll get to that. So we're talking before that. It's technically it's called Hellenic, which is not Hellenism, Hellenistic. It's just straight Greek only. So, sidebar, crazy thought related, but I don't have a good way of tying this in yet. Just sort of me showing my hands is how my brain works. And you'll see how this ties in, especially when we really spend some time on the Bronze Age collapse and the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey and Homer and the Trojan War and Achilles, and how all of these seemingly silly, pointless, fable, mythical stories are actually a form of remembering a rather traumatic time in history. But anyway, so the whole thing. So if you read the Odyssey, the entire Odyssey was sparked by Helen of Troy, and it's just interesting. I don't have an answer yet. That Hellenic and Hellenistic and Hellenism and the Hellenes are phonically related to Helen of Troy, the very thing that caused I don't know, the Bronze Age collapse and a Greek Dark Age for 400 years. So, and the reason I'm showing you this is this will make sense the further into this weirdness we go. So we are talking about Isaac. When we talk about Greece, we're talking about Isaac. This is a harp, and it's associated with different characters throughout mythology. And one character, biblically speaking, that is well known for playing the harp is the figure of David. But there's almost this synonymousness, and you can go to an antique store, just start walking around, and you'll see that much of the 1800s or 19th century, if you will, is very Greek in nature. And when you find Greek things, you will very often, especially musical related things, but in general, you'll find this shape, this harp shape. Right? David played the harp for Saul. Harp. This is Paris, I believe, who fell in love with Helen of Troy, sparking and stole her from King whatever his name was. I'll butcher it if I say it without looking at it. And I just want you to look, because there's many harps, but this harp, right, and this is one that is related to Judaism because of the David story, not because of the Greek story, which I will begin tying together in a rather unforeseen way. In fact, I'm pretty goddamn sure I'm the only one that's going to make that connection. Like an idiot. At least I don't pick the biggest enemies. So, what I want to show you is there was Adam's rib turned into a thing. There's going to be Jacob's hip is going to turn into a thing. There's visual cues hidden in the story. One of those visual cues is the harp that David plays, or the harp that a Greek mythological god might play. I'm trying to think of who that would be. Apollo, probably. Paris in this story, but he's not, other than the Helen of Troy story, he's not really important. So this is ancient Greece. And what I want you to notice is, again, it's abstract, so it's not going to be 100% perfect. It's somebody describing a thing, and you go, huh, interesting. I can see that. I can see this Aegean Sea area being the harp that David plays, right? This is a person who plays Greece. This is somebody who understands the region. It is a metaphor of this area. Now, back to Isaac's wife, Rebekah. She is the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian, of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Syrian. So when I see a sentence like that, I go, here we go. And I begin breaking down Bethel, Syrian, Padan, Aram, Laban, and Syrian again. And I put them all together and I go, well, that's what that says. And that's typically what you need to do if you ever want it to be more than just a good Sunday school Bible Sunday school story, right? So, Bethuel, dweller in God. Syria, right? Syria, you would just dismiss and say, well, it's Syria, the country, the area. And I would say Nay, nay, Syria is relating to something. They happen to name Syria because we assume Syria meant Syria, but that's not how that worked. Just like you will go through the country today of Israel, and you will notice the country is populated with Bible names of towns they assume meant that thing. Now, I have also recently watched an archaeologist talk about that very situation and how, interestingly, those towns have been named that for a long time. But they usually can't go much past, say, 2nd, 3rd century AD, when Christians start nosing around the area of Palestine, going, I think that's the town they're talking about, and they start applying names, and then the Arabs take. So it's like there's an unbroken Christian, Muslim, Jewish connection to that area since about the time of Rome. So it is interesting. So in this case, Syria would mean something like highland, high, swelling up, increasing, and then Padan Aram would mean something like plain of swelling up and increasing. So if you put this little piece together, the daughter of Bethel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, it would mean something like the dweller in God, or let's apply what we said about God. And God is the spirit of humanity, and oftentimes God in the Bible is the common people. So it would be how do I want to put this? The common people, humanity, so it'd be like the spirit of humanity, but it comes in the form of average people. So the people who rose up, who swelled up and increased on the plain of Aram, right? So it's almost saying something like a popular uprising in Aram. And Aram would be related to Abraham. So I think you can see that from the people that rose up against, right? So how do I put this? It's essentially saying something like it's a people's revolt. So the people of the people's revolt, the people that rose against the high people, the people on the mountain, the sister of Laban the Syrian, the sister of Laban. Laban is, where is Laban? Your first two planes, here we go, Laban. So this one means like noble, glorious. Again, in the high places. So there was elite nobles, and the sister of the elite nobles would be the common people. So the common people of the land of Abraham rose up against the nobles. And the Greeks come from those common people that killed their leaders and accidentally or on purpose burnt down civilization in 1177 the year civilization collapsed. And that collapse, they claim, was caused by the Sea People, a group of people who come out of seemingly nowhere. And I'm saying the Bible spells this out to you so clear it hurts. It appears there's a people's revolt. And after 400 years of quote-unquote darkness, you have the Greeks and let me just say this, it is interesting that the Greeks are known for democracy. And if you're following my story, democracy would be the opposite of Laban, of a noble high person. But his sister would be the people, the republic, the democracy that came out of seemingly nowhere, out of the darkness, if you will, a darkness that historians really still don't have a great answer for. And I'm just giving you the answer. People burnt the fucker down. Eventually they built the fucker up. It's in the Bible. Interesting. So that's who that is, right? So Rebecca would be the culture that comes out of this people's revolt eventually. This culture of people's rule and art and beauty and philosophy and science. It's a really interesting story if you think about it. The decadence of one culture and its death led to the rise of what is considered the greatest, most beautiful classic civilization of all time. Food for thought. So now the people that are married to this new culture, these Greeks, these ancient Greeks, well, they didn't have any offspring. They just stayed ancient Greeks, right? So one of the things that happens with a democracy and a real attention to things like liberty and freedom is you tend to really like liberty and freedom, which means you really are able to see that if you start forcing that on other people, it sort of mucks up the whole water. So they weren't what I would call an aggressive, conquering people. The classical Greeks, right? So the democratic Greeks did not conquer vast swaths of land. They were barren. But their culture, their cultural leaders pleaded with the people, with the spirit of humanity, with God, and God said, I gotcha. This will spread. We will spread this culture. We will give you an offspring. So his wife conceived. She is now pregnant. During her pregnancy, but the children struggled together within her. And she said, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went to inquire of the Lord. So whoever these two children are, as they began to grow, it was causing some form of clash inside of her civilization, inside of the culture itself. And she went to the people and was like, the children struggled together within her, right? That's a weird thing if you don't have a context and you're just telling a story. Hey, my wife was pregnant and the kids, boy, they were just getting to fighting every night in that belly. That is not the story. And it even tells you what the story is, right? So as soon as she says that to God, God then says, hey, check this out. And I'm going to break this down each of these little lines together. So the first one is, if I ever needed help proving my point, here you go. Genesis 25, verse 23. This quote unquote woman is pregnant with quote unquote boys in her quote unquote belly that they are quote unquote fighting. And the first thing quote unquote God says to her is, 2 nations are in your womb. I've had kids. I've never had a nation. So I think what they mean by 2 nations are in your womb is, well, I might be crazy, but I think it means there's 2 nations in your womb, which would then mean, based on biblical analysis, that Jacob and Esau would not be people, but they would be people groups, or as we like to call them, nations, which means you should be looking for a nation, not a man, 2 individual pieces of humans, right? 2 nations are in your womb, which now automatically makes this entire story metaphorical. 2 peoples, peoples will be nations, right? So these 2 nations will be separated from your body. Now, one could argue that if you took the first verse away and you just had the second one, then if a woman was pregnant with twins, then they indeed, within 40 weeks, 9 months, would be separated from that woman. This is going a little bit more metaphorical. These people will be separated from you. They will no longer be ancient Greece. That's what that's saying. One of those groups will kick the shit out of the other group. And you should be able to find that historically. And the older group will not be that group, because the older group will end up serving the younger group. Right? I'm making this up. So, when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. Ancient Greece was about to push out 2 groups, 2 nations, 2 people groups were about to be inspired by the classical Greek world. The mother, right? So the culture is going to infect 2 other not Greece countries. So who are these 2 sons of classical Greece? Well, they tell you. First one, or the older one, the one that will serve the younger one, he came out red and was hairy he was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau. And Esau means hairy. And literalists, if I was with a woman who gave birth to a red, hairy nation, and there was still another nation in her womb, we would no longer be together. That freaks me out thinking about it. I've seen some hairy babies, but I've never seen that. So we are automatically going towards a metaphor. So when it says red, hairy garment, not just hairy garment, they called him Esau. So I'm going to say, just like so many other words, you just have to pick them up and you'll see them sprinkled. So it's kind of like doing a Sudoku or something. Like you just have to go, well, it's not any of these. Oh, well, over here it's this. Well, it meant that here, so it probably means that here. And so you have to sort of learn to just absorb, and place as needed. So I can tell you with some level of confidence, when you see the term hairy, it doesn't actually mean hairy. It means something like conqueror. And when you see the word red, it doesn't mean he had red hair. And if you remember the first couple images, Esau always has red hair. Now, the beauty of a story is 2,000 years later, when we forgot what the hell the story means, the important details are there. What it's actually saying is something to the extent of this first kid that kind of came about the same time, and they're about equal, so we're going to call them twins, and they're both associated with their, like you could call them some form of offshoot of classical Greek culture. The first one came out kicking ass and taking names. He was a conqueror and red. Red means something like regal. It's like an empire. The emperor is always red. The red is like the color of power. So this conquering king. So he comes out, the oldest comes out like a conquering king. That's what red and hairy means. And I will show you who I think that is referring to, and I believe that the first one is Macedonia. And if you know anything about ancient Greece, is everybody wants to say the most is like this Hellenistic world that conquered a bunch of things, but that technically is wrong. That forgets the reality that there was a super draining civil war between Spartan and Athens that drew everybody in, wore everybody out, and ultimately led to like this Theban league kind of coming into power as those two had exhausted themselves, and that lasted about no time at all before the Macedonians, who technically were a different country. They were related. One could call them a son of Greece. Just sort of rides in, starts sort of helping out, and just says, fuck it, we're going all the way. And they take over. They conquer. They literally emerge as the first real king, right? So before that, you still had this semblance of democracy, but the Thebans were kind of riding that line pretty close. But Alexander the Great, the king of Macedonia, the son of Philip of Macedon, defeated the Greeks, which meant he was not the Greeks, even though he was Greek. He spoke Greek. He was Greek-like. He became Greece. Greece became an empire under their first real taste of not democracy. Red conqueror literally came out of the womb rocking. So when did Macedonia kind of start? Now there's different stages of these things. but the general consensus is somewhere between 650 and 550 BC, you begin to have a separate but sort of affiliated Macedonia. And then within about 200 to 300 years, Bladau, out comes Philip, and then out comes Alexander the Great. So, what I'm saying is your red conquering hero, Esau, is what begins as Alexander of Macedon becomes the Hellenistic, this new Hellenism that goes east and conquers, right? So it becomes this new power, the Greek power in the region, right? So it came out, where is it at? It was the first thing separated from ancient Greece is the Greek Empire of Alexander and the 4 subsequent Greek Hellenistic empires that spread throughout the world. They separated from the old classical Greek, right? It left the region and it left the belief, right? It went from being just this classical Greek civilization to this Hellenistic, half Greek, half Eastern philosophy. And that's, so Esau is the Greeks, the Hellenized Greeks. The Hellenism is Esau, more specifically than just Alexander. It starts as Alexander, but it ends as the Hellenistic world, to include the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and all of the different versions of that are all Esau. Afterward, his brother came out and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob because he took hold of Esau's heel. So Jacob literally means heel catcher, layer in weights for planter, leaving behind, bringing to an end, heel catcher. And how do you, again, this is a visual like the harp, like the rib, like the hip. We have a heel. The heel catcher, right? He's catching them by the heel. Notice that the yellow is Greek and the orange is the early Roman Etruscan groups that are not Greeks that are beginning to emerge, right? Here you have Greece did have some colonies, but it wasn't quite the same as this conquering thing. It was just them going out and setting up lands in a slightly different way. Lots of people did it, but they weren't leaving their Greekness. They were just sort of filtering out. And as you can see, they had the heel of the famous boot. And who grabbed? Right, so here is Esau. Here is him coming out red and hairy. And this is after the death of Alexander. You had these split up. But it is still Esau. So all of these are Esau. Notice that they are not, the colonies are not really part of the empire. They're just sort of trying to. So as these boys grow up, and I guess I'm going to show you a little better, but if the thing grabbing the heel is early Rome, that would make Jacob Rome, grabbing the heel of the Greeks. See Macedon, right? This is the Hellenistic world. And notice that Rome begins to grow, as does Greece all of a sudden, where it went from a thing that didn't really go nowhere to a thing that really went places. And at the same time, you have this third thing just lingering in the background, waiting to be dealt with, and that is much of the history of Rome. Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild. Down here it says complete man dwelling in the tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So Esau, remember, in the Bible, when you read the word field, field is synonymous with field of battle. So if Jacob is a skillful hunter, it means he is a warrior culture. He's good at conquering. He's a conquering nation. I would argue that Alexander's Macedonian Empire was a pretty skillful hunter. And I would argue that Greece loved Alexander because they got to benefit from the riches of Persia and India and Egypt as they filtered in. And so the Greeks went from these like mild-mannered democratic people to sort of these full-flung Eastern kings, if you will, right? That decadence. They loved what Alexander was selling. Isaac, the people, loved the Greek Hellenistic world. But Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents. Jacob wasn't going anywhere. He was almost more classical Greece than current Greece at that time, right? If you look over here, Jacob, Rome did not go out conquering. Not at first, right? Rome just sort of did what they had to do, and they were very, like, if you go to high school history class, I remember Romans were practical. The Greeks were like creative and philosophical and artistic, but the Romans were practical. They were engineers, right? They were these but we refer to this entire time period as Greco-Roman. So all their architecture is just Greeks. It's just Greek architecture with a Roman, what would you call it, practicalness stamped right all over it. So Jacob liked to stay in his tents, and tents is another word that just means in his own area. Tent is like your little different districts or regions or whatever is within inside of your country or empire. Those are your tents. And Rebekah loved Jacob because Rebekah, if you remember, is classical Greek, not Hellenism. So the old school ways. Rome was old school. This new Greek empire was too Eastern, where Rome kept it real, right? Rome slowly but surely just kept growing, and usually it was just because somebody kept fucking with them, and they're like, please stop fucking with us. And they weren't looking for trouble, but by God, trouble was looking for them. So What I haven't said yet, and I should have added to this, but I did not, is this map here is about 200. This map here is another around 200. So if Macedonia began to emerge, they were saying around 650. There's a couple dates that are associated with the founding of Rome. There's the old one of Romulus and Remus, and that is something like 700 and something BC. But if you go to like the actual founding of Rome, it is usually around 530, 520. That is when they start to say Rome was becoming this first republic slash had kings sort of at first, so it wasn't full republic. But that's the other thing, right? So if Rebecca was classical Greece, well, classical Greece was a republic, and Jacob was a republic, and those republics tended to not be very conquery. That tends to happen when you get hairy and red. So we read approximately 10 verses or so. We haven't gotten to where he sold his birthright. We haven't gotten to the Greek-Roman interactions that begin to occur. So just if you understand the story and you start it in the right place, who would have thought that Hellenistic Greeks and Romans are twin brothers? Huh. And I think if you just let your brain percolate with this, not only does it make sense, but you can begin to see there is an abundant amount of trouble brewing when you begin to realize this is probably true. Some of those little threads that I told you that they begin to unravel things, unfortunately, this one is a Gordian knot of trouble that exists inside of this understanding. I'll just let that. And so much of what you need to understand is dependent upon your understanding that Isaac and Jacob and Esau are Greece and Rome in the East, the Greek East. And it becomes the Greek East, this Hellenism. Because if it's these three things, then it's not other things. So I'm going to leave this here. We'll pick up with a little stew.